Merci infiniment, Monsieur le Président, pour votre intervention. Nous allons maintenant accueillir quelqu'un que nous connaissons également parfaitement. Il s'agit de Monsieur Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, ancien secrétaire général de l'OTAN, qui nous fait l'honneur de participer à nos travaux. Il ne pouvait en être autrement en organisant cette session annuelle aux Pays-Bas. Vous avez exercé des fonctions très importantes au sein de l'OTAN entre 2004 et 2009, 5 années durant lesquelles s'est nouée une forte relation avec les membres de notre Assemblée. C'est un très grand plaisir de vous retrouver aujourd'hui et je rappelle qu'à l'issue de votre allocution, vous avez accepté d'échanger avec l'auditoire. Les délégués qui souhaitent poser une question seront donc les bienvenus. Ils sont engagés à nous le faire savoir et ils sont invités donc très vite à le faire. Monsieur le secrétaire général, vous avez la parole.
Un grand merci, Madame. Je me souviens que dans les années que Madame Aléomari était ministre de la Défense en France, elle a insisté sur la qualification Madame le ministre. Alors pour moi c'est un peu compliqué si vous êtes Madame le Président ou Madame la Présidente. En tout cas, Madam President. Distinguished members of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, it is a great pleasure and a privilege for me to be back and to have the opportunity to have a discussion with you. But I'll not start that discussion before having congratulated you wholeheartedly with the 60 years that the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is in existence. I think it has always played a very important role. I'll have a word about it in a moment. My heartfelt congratulations in this regard. And let me also congratulate the incoming President, Congressman Mike Turner. I'm absolutely sure, Mike Turner, that under your leadership, this NATO Parliamentary Assembly will continue to play the important role it has played, and I have every title to say this because I once was a member myself. Madam President, distinguished members of the Parliamentary Assembly, when this morning I was very briefly in a radio broadcast, the interviewer asked me, "You're going to speak to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly this afternoon. Do they have formal power?" And my answer was, "No, sir, they might not have many formal powers, but they are very influential, because they are the ones in their home countries who should not only defend NATO, but to be ambassadors for NATO, and to convince their fellow parliamentarians, non-members of this Parliamentary Assembly, and even more important, their public opinion that NATO matters and why NATO matters." And that is the reason that I'm privileged to speak to you this afternoon, and that is also the reason that in my active period as NATO Secretary General, I always made it a point, as some of you might remember, to attend and to speak to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. It is of great importance that you speak to your governments and that you help convince your public opinion that NATO is relevant. I'm saying this having listened to the incumbent Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, this morning. I'm saying this, dear friends of the Assembly, because it is one thing to convince the usual suspects. And as we're sitting in this hall, we all are usual suspects, including myself, as a former Secretary General, a former Foreign Minister. But we have to convince the non-usual suspects. They are the ones, also represented in parliaments, who have to be convinced that NATO matters, who have to be convinced that in the discussion going on in any nation, in any country, are we going to spend on education? Are we going to spend on healthcare? Are we going to spend on social benefits? That security should be part of this equation. And I know from experience that this is far from easy. And I hope, having said this, Madam President, that alliance leaders who agreed in Newport in Wales not that long ago, and the Secretary General made reference to this decision this morning several times, that they're going to live up to their promises. Because I've seen, and you have seen many times, that they did not do that. It's one thing to make a commitment in Wales. It's quite another thing to bring that commitment into practice. To cite an example from this country, my country, the Netherlands, we have seen huge defense cuts, like almost all around NATO. And we now are overjoyed that the tide has turned, and that 100 million euros will be added each year to the defense budget. This is no reason for hip hip hooray, and my political party was as responsible as many others for these defense cuts. So you'll not hear me say hip hip hooray, because we are still, in the present period, cutting on defense budgets. And as we all know, security does come as a price. In other words, the leaders, heads of states and government, should honor their commitment in Wales and see that they get NATO and their own countries on a sound financial footing. Now, we listened to the chairperson of the audit board in the Netherlands this morning. I'm not going to go down in technicalities, but I think when we discuss the question how we finance our alliance, we should also have a debate on what we commonly fund and where we apply the principle, costs lie where they fall. I'll explain why I'm saying this. We have a NATO response force, and we now have the so-called spearhead force, an even more quick reaction force. But what problem has haunted the NATO response force, as you might know, it is the way we finance the NRF. Because if a nation is so unlucky, quote unquote, that they participate for 6 months in the NATO response force and something happens, they have to pay, because they had committed to the NRF before. So the NRF, in financial terms, is a reverse lottery, as I said, being Secretary General. You hope that the NRF or a quick reaction force will not be put into action because you pay. So my point would be, let's start, or rather restart the discussion within NATO on how we finance the alliance and who pays for what. There are alternatives. You can, if you decide for an ISAF operation in Afghanistan, you can attribute a budget to such an operation. The United Nations, as you might know, has a system that nations participating in operations are reimbursed for their participation. In other words, let's try to be as inventive as possible, Madam President. My second remark is about NATO proper. NATO is a political military alliance. In that order, a political military alliance, acting, as we all know, on the basis of political consensus. NATO is not, and NATO should not develop into a coalition of the willing and able. In other words, when NATO embarks on an operation, there should always, before, be a full 100% political consensus on that operation. I'm making this remark because I think, but I'm an outside commentator now, that when NATO decided to act, quite rightly so, over Libya some time ago, there were some NATO allies who already told the alliance before, we will not participate. Now, I understand that not all 28 NATO member states will always participate in any operation. But let's have the political consensus first to prevent that NATO becomes a coalition of the willing and able on a permanent basis. My third remark, a diplomat, as I've been almost all my life, so I'll start in a diplomatic fashion, would say that it is no secret that the security context and the security situation in Europe is far from benign. That's diplomatic terminology. A bit more clear language would say the security situation in Europe close to our door is very serious indeed. I'll take you one step further with your agreement or disagreement, I'll hear about that later this afternoon, is that the security situation in Europe is potentially dangerous. Why? We are confronted with a Russian leader, which is first of all a zero-sum game thinker. He has perfected zero-sum game thinking in the Kremlin, and he has thrown aside two basic principles. The first, of course, is one does not change borders but by consent. And the second is that sovereign states have the freedom to choose their own political destiny. And what Vladimir Putin is doing, he's trying to recreate a bond of states where he has exclusive influence and political saying, and in that ambition, Ukraine is the linchpin. And when we say he shouldn't get away with this, means that we should be serious. NATO should be serious. And I think NATO should first of all do everything within its power and within its mandate to deter Vladimir Putin to embark on any step or measure where he might violate NATO territory or create unrest or upheaval on NATO territory. I use the word deter. We don't like that word very much anymore after the Cold War, where we're talking about deterrence, but deterrence is what is at stake here. We should deter him, Vladimir Putin, for going further after he has already gone much too far. And then we go from the assumption that the Russian leader is a 100% rational leader. We hope he is. But what if he is rational for 95%? Do we have to prepare for that 5% irrationality, which might lead to irrational decision-making? You can't give me the guarantee, and I can't you give the guarantee that Vladimir Putin is for 100% rational. And that means that we also have to be prepared for irrational scenarios. And that might sound easy from a comfortable position in a conference center in The Hague. But when you live, when a glass breaks, it brings luck. Let's hope so. We say in Dutch. But if you live in Tallinn, you live in Riga, you live in Vilnius, it is quite a different and another matter, I can assure you. So we better be serious. And I think our alliance leaders in Wales and Newport were serious by doing what we have to do. And I hope they take that decision very seriously indeed, as well as they should their financial decisions. That is prepositioning equipment. That is increase our exercises. And when I say have more live exercises, not only tabletop exercises, that means, in my view also, that we pick up a point which was for my generation, which grew up in the Cold War, a common thing. And those were the exercises where the Americans transported a combat brigade from the United States of America to Europe. Reforger, return of forces to Germany. That was the qualification in the Cold War. This is also a type of exercise which would fit my image of deter Vladimir Putin of going further. And I'm saying this under the heading that if Article 5, the core of NATO, is a credible article, and we are all of the opinion that it is a credible article, deterrence should be credible. And I say again, you might not like the word, but a credible Article 5 means a credible deterrence. Having said this, I think we should do everything we can to keep the channel of dialogue with Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation open. And that also means that I hope that suspension of the NATO-Russia Council, which is the only formal institution we have within NATO, will not be locked down for dialogue. As we did under my chairmanship, I admit that was not the best decision we took in 2008 after the Russians invaded Georgia. You can be tough, and you should be tough on the one hand, but given the fact that there is no military solution, we should keep political channels open, how complicated and how difficult that might be. It's interesting, Madam President, distinguished members, it's interesting to note, by the way, that when we discuss Ukraine, it is not so much about NATO, but about the European Union, where Putin is now becoming and has become nervous. In 2008, as you remember, it was Membership Action Plan for Georgia, which led finally to the Russian invasion into Georgia. Now, it is the European Union. It is Ukraine wanting to move closer to the European Union, which for Vladimir Putin is the reason that he has violated international law and that he has done what he has done. And I heard someone say a week ago, this is for the reason that Ukrainians want to be Poles. They see how Poland has developed, and they want the same wealth, the same freedoms as they see in Poland and any other nation you represent here today. It's about the European Union, and Putin apparently is afraid that Ukraine will infect Russia when it would be successful in coming closer to the European Union. Don't misunderstand me. Let's not make false promises to Ukraine of being able to become a European Union member. Let's not do that. That is dishonest, because we all know that will not work. As we all know that Ukraine has to become very, very serious indeed to fight corruption, to seek the rule of law, to seek good governance, and there I'll make a few remarks about the European Union, because I think that is not primarily NATO business. And in my opinion, the European Union should take itself very, very seriously, having embarked upon the partnership association agreements, to come to the assistance of Ukraine and Georgia. And we tend to forget, distinguished members, Moldova from time to time, perhaps because it's a small country, as are the Netherlands. The European Union should now take its responsibility to live up to the promises they made to Ukraine, to Moldova, to Georgia. So that they can successfully work further to their Euro-Atlantic integration. And one final word about Vladimir Putin. I think, quite honestly, he is not as successful as we might think from time to time. Because at the end of the day, he's now confronted with the most pro-European government in Kiev we've ever seen. His president fled the country after Maidan. There were elections. Unfortunately and dramatically not all over Ukraine, and now there is a very Western pro-European Union government. I wouldn't like it if I were Vladimir Putin, but thank heavens I'm not. I mentioned already the European Union, and I want to say a brief word about energy, because one of the weaknesses of Europe, of the European Union of course, is that, in my opinion, we are too dependent on energy flowing to our part of the world from Russia. I think we should take that very seriously, and that means that we should discuss reverse flows, that we should discuss interconnection between pipelines, that I hope that the US administration at a certain stage will lift the ban on exporting oil or exporting gas. I commend Lithuania with finishing an LNG terminal in that country, because that dependency should diminish. We are too dependent on Russian energy. That means also, in my view, that we should have a serious discussion if it is wise to build South Stream, a pipeline which will make us even more dependent from Russian gas. Madam President, distinguished members, I agree, coming back to NATO, with the policy experts group, which under the chairmanship of Robin Niblett from Chatham House produced its report in June 2014, so not that long ago, that inside NATO we should not have a division of labor in the alliance between a few members who take responsibility for hard power projection and the others who prefer to sit back and do soft power specialization. I think that would not be good for NATO. There's a word for this which is called undiplomatically free riding. We should not have free riding within NATO, and also in this regard should have an equal sharing of the burden. No hard power projection by a few and soft by the others. I think it is an important principle. And when NATO gets involved in non-Article 5 operations, Afghanistan was already mentioned many times today, and here you come again into play, distinguished members of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. When NATO gets involved in an operation, like a complicated operation in ISAF, which is now coming to an end, then let us be honest to public opinion, let us be honest to our constituencies, and trustworthy in the kind of narrative we use to justify that operation. Afghanistan, dear friends, distinguished members, was not a nation-building operation, it was a war-fighting mission. We needed war-fighting because we wanted to rebuild Afghanistan. And in this country, and that's why I'm mentioning it, we had an endless debate in Parliament. Is this a fighting mission? Is this a reconstruction mission? Of course it was a fighting mission. And public opinion is not stupid. So let's learn that lesson. I'm saying to you, but I'm also saying to myself, let's learn that lesson. Be honest in how you defend an operation, because public opinion, and we saw public opinion going down in the course of the ISAF operation, public opinion will not be fooled. They are no fools. An important lesson I took away from 5.5 years at the helm of NATO. Let me finally make a point I made many times before, and it was also mentioned earlier today, and some of you might know my maxim. Let's work on NATO-EU relations. There's a new Secretary General of NATO, for the first time not coming from an EU country, but I don't see that as an impediment. There's a new High Representative. NATO-EU relationship, the NATO-EU relationship is a very important one. And I think it is still strange that it is not much closer and much more intensive than it should be, in my words. I know final decisions will not be made by the NATO Secretary General, not be made by the High Representative. Final decisions will be made by heads of states and government. But I hope that you will support my maxim and my mantra, because I think the two sides of Brussels, the two institutions in Brussels, are still much too wide apart. Finally, let us invest as much as we can in NATO's partners and partnerships in Europe. I was discussing with my Finnish friend who spoke before me the positions of Finland and Sweden. Strong supporters of ISAF in Afghanistan, and that is in Europe, that's close to home. But I'm also talking about Australia, New Zealand. I'm talking about investing in the Mediterranean dialogue. I know that part of the world is chaotic, but let's invest in our dialogue with North Africa, with the Arab nations, with Israel. Let's not forget about the Gulf states, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. Let's invest in those partners. We need them. We needed them in Afghanistan. Now in the Middle East, of course, it's not NATO, it's a coalition. But it is important to have as close a relationship with them as possible. Madam President, I'll finish. There's a lot to be proud about in NATO. And there's a lot to be proud about when you are a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Because in those 60 years, you have been an institution which one shouldn't forget, which one will not forget, and which, in my opinion, should make it a point of explaining over and over again to the non-usual suspects that NATO matters, that NATO is about values to be upheld. That's NATO matters. That has been my mantra, my maxim. I'm absolutely sure that Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg will act exactly the same. It was a privilege to speak to you this afternoon, and I'm ready to take your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Please stay here. Merci de Karl également. Merci infiniment pour cet éclairage remarquable. Nous avons déjà une série de questions. Je voudrais donner dès à présent la parole à l'Arménie, Monsieur Tevan Pokosian. Je vous en prie.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Scheffer, I'm Tevan Pokosian, member of Armenian Parliament and also president of Armenia Atlantic Association, member of ATA. We have met in this capacity also. Since 2004, annual NATO weeks have been held in Armenia within the framework of IPA. And the Armenia Atlantic Association has actively contributed to this event. We have implemented more than 20 projects during these NATO weeks and has specifically targeted rural youth in order to increase their knowledge about NATO, its goals and functions. Regrettably, during the last 3 years, the ranking and political level of visiting NATO officials has gone down. Moreover, no representative from headquarters attended the NATO week this year that took place just a week ago. I would like to inquire whether this is a reflection of official NATO policy or just an unintended consequences. In either case, it gives the wrong impression of differentiated treatment among partners, that actions by some of our neighbors endangering regional security through boosting sniper war, killing civilians taken hostage, can go unnoticeable or unpunishable. I would appreciate your reflection. Thank you.
Merci. Nous allons prendre deux autres demandes. Le Royaume-Uni, Monsieur Mike Gapes. Please.
Thank you very much. I was pleased that you said that there should be much closer cooperation between the European Union and NATO. In that context, when only 4 NATO members are spending the 2% target figure of GDP on defence, is it not unnecessary duplication for some of those countries which are not spending the 2% to be pressing for structural headquarters solutions within the European Union, rather than pressing for more efficient use of the existing institutional frameworks and for European Union NATO cooperation using NATO assets for European Union defence purposes?
Merci beaucoup pour votre question. Je passe à la Géorgie. Monsieur Georgi Baramitse. Georgia.
Merci beaucoup. I would like to, first of all, express my appreciation to meet our old friend and appreciation, Jaap, for your continuous support to Georgia's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and UN and NATO integration process. And I would like to underline how much I enjoyed cooperation with you when you were the Secretary General and I was serving in the Georgian government, and help that was coming from you and valuable advice. It was very, very important for us. And today is unfortunately very bad days for Eastern European countries. For Georgia, today Vladimir Putin signed a so-called agreement with the proxy government on occupied territories, thus annexing these territories. Crimea is annexed. We have war in eastern Ukraine, and Moldova is under the danger. And Vladimir Putin thinks that he have achieved whatever he wanted. From one hand, he has enlarged Russia. He has stopped development of the countries that they think, then he thinks it's an area of the influence of Russia. And from other hand, he also thinks that he has stopped our integration with that of both NATO and European Union. You mentioned 2008, and you mentioned the Vladimir Putin's irrationality. Shall we, based on what we have learned, that he does not appreciate kind of gestures and kind of weak signals, that now we have to have stronger and more decisive policies and more, let's say, courageously acknowledge achievements of the countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, in order to, based on the merits, let these countries, let our countries to become full-fledged members whenever we reach the criteria and whenever we will be ready. And I really hope that these days are not too far away. What will be your opinion? Thank you.
Beaucoup. Je vous donne la parole, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Let me start answering the distinguished representative of Armenia, but let me also start by saying that I do not anymore, of course, represent official NATO policy. I'm on my own, which is a very comfortable thought, because if I state stupid things, they say the guy is stupid, and I do not have the trouble of having either a political party, a nation, or an alliance. But so I do not know why visits of NATO officials have gone down. My political judgment would be that not perhaps so much in NATO, but in the European Union, there was at a certain stage a certain ambition to see Armenia entering the EU partnership as well, like Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine. That did not happen. That is a choice the sovereign state, the sovereign nation of Armenia has made, so there can be no discussion about this. But why NATO officials visit Armenia in lesser numbers, I couldn't possibly answer you. Remembering my own visits to Armenia very vividly, and I do think that there is every reason, given the fact that we're having a dialogue here, that NATO and Armenia should, within the range of the possible, have the best relations we can imagine. Not for nothing, I mentioned at the end of my speech the importance of having good relations with NATO partners. But again, I have to say, I'm sorry, but official NATO policy I do not represent anymore. On EU and NATO, I am not, and I was not, and I will not make pleas for fully integrated headquarters, sir. The plea I'm making is that I do see that there are scenarios of which I can think, and Mali is just an example, where the United States would come to the European allies with the message over to you guys. I can imagine scenarios, I mentioned Mali again, but there are other scenarios possible, that the European Union as an institution, using of course the same soldiers and military as NATO uses. I mean, we do not have EU soldiers with and NATO soldiers. It is one single set of forces, as we know. But let me share with you my disappointment. I think Mali was an excellent example where the United States of America was not able and willing already, for good reasons, to intervene militarily. Where were the European Union battle groups when they could have been found, but they could not be found? Then France, and I pay credit to France, intervened bilaterally. And now, of course, we see a United Nations operation where the Dutch, by the way, the Dutch government and many other governments very actively participate militarily. I think that's a missed opportunity, but that would not have been a NATO operation. It could have been a European Union operation, based on a close relationship between the two. I'm not a federalist. I'm not in favor of a European army, to avoid any misunderstanding, because I've been a member of parliament in this country for 16 years, and I could not imagine that I would ever agree to sending a young boy, Dutch boy or girl, into harm's way when that decision is not to the national parliament. So I'm against a European army, no federalist. But I think it is a waste of time and political ambition and energy that the European Union in the field of security and defense is still in a sort of embryonic stage. The European security strategy of the European Union dates back to 2003. I think you and I will quickly agree that the world doesn't look the same as it did in 2003 when Javier Solana, credit where credit is due, as the then High Representative, developed that strategy. So I think we should and could do much more in this regard. Using NATO assets, yes. But I could also very well imagine that something the other way around would happen at a certain stage. No misunderstanding once again. Big military operations, Article 5 scenarios, but other big military operations will always involve NATO, because they will always involve the United States of America. But I can mention other scenarios, as I did, where another option might be chosen. Minister Baramidze, that is a very pertinent question you're asking, and I'll answer you in all honesty. And thank you for crediting my mandate as Secretary General. Indeed, I was and still am close to Georgia, and that goes for Ukraine and Moldova the same, by the way. But you also know that in 2008, in that Bucharest summit, there was what I say with an understatement, something of a fight within the alliance before the final communique came out. Ukraine and NATO can be NATO members, and it was a membership action plan then. So I said, the principle that nations who choose the political family they want to belong to should be upheld. I do not think, and I do not see, and that's why I say you get an honest answer, I do not see under present circumstances, not in the immediately foreseeable future, that Georgia, or Ukraine for that matter, but you're from Georgia, would be able to quickly fulfill its full ambition for Euro-Atlantic integration. I don't see it because I simply see too much division within our own ranks. Let's call a spade here. I see too much division in our own ranks. And even then in Bucharest, you know that both Germany and France were very, very strongly against membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine. Georgia doesn't have it, Ukraine doesn't have it, we have the commissions, let's use them to the full extent. But as I said, let's not make false promises in the domain of the European Union, as I said in my speech. Let also not make false promises as far as NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine is concerned, because then when we would meet again here or in Tbilisi in 2, 3, 4 years' time, you would say, where were you with your hollow promises? And I'm not going to make hollow promises. I saw some people doing that in Maidan. Those are promises which cannot be fulfilled. And I think a politician should, as much as he or she can, be honest. On rationality, irrationality, Minister Baramidze, I agree with you. That's why I made a point that Vladimir Putin is weaker than we tend to think, because somebody who talks from a position of strength is less inclined to take irrational decisions than somebody who's weak. So weakness leads earlier to irrational decisions than strength, in my opinion. At the same time, you heard, I hope, clearly what I said about the responsibilities of the European Union vis-à-vis Georgia, and that they should be as much as they could. Madam President, I think I answered the questions put to me.
Thank you very much. But we have maybe to be a little bit more rapid.
Un peu plus
rapide. Nous allons un peu accélérer.
Oui, d'accord.
Nous allons passer en français du trop.
Non, je comprends. Oui,
nous allons passer du trop.
Je suis trop long. D'accord.
Du trop au galop.
Trop au galop. D'accord.
Parce que j'ai encore 6 intervenants.
Je suis dans vos mains.
You are right. Je donne la parole à l'Espagne, Diego López Garrido.
I will ask you in Spanish, please. Gracias, Mr. Scheffer, por su intervención muy clara, muy directa. Usted ha empezado hablando de la necesidad de que a la opinión pública europea, a la opinión pública de los países que forman la OTAN, la Alianza Atlántica, se consiga llegar con la idea de que importa, que la OTAN importa, que es importante. Uno de los aspectos en donde la opinión pública entendería mejor que la OTAN importa es en la cuestión de la colaboración entre las Fuerzas Armadas de los países que la componen, de la industria militar, de las capacidades militares. Eso es lo que se ha venido llamando pooling and sharing, o se ha llamado la smart defense. Pero tengo la sensación de que una de las razones por las cuales se ha hecho tanto hincapié en Cardiff y hoy mismo por el secretario general, el nuevo secretario general Stoltenberg, en el asunto del aumento de los gastos de defensa, es en que esa idea de pooling and sharing o smart defense de alguna manera ha fracasado. No se ha logrado que desembocase en un ahorro económico también, ¿no? A mí me gustaría preguntarle cuál es su opinión sobre si realmente la idea de que la OTAN sirviera para imbricar, integrar, colaborar mucho más entre las Fuerzas Armadas que componen la OTAN, de alguna manera no se ha conseguido. Y por eso se pide ahora ya que cada uno aporte más como la única forma de remediar ese cierto fracaso. Muchas gracias.
Je donne la parole maintenant à Marc Angel du Luxembourg.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Ma question rejoint un peu la question de notre collègue anglais et l'ancien secrétaire général a déjà en partie répondu et je voulais le remercier pour son exposé et sa longue expérience politique a prouvé qu'il connaît bien l'Union européenne et il connaît donc l'OTAN. Et je voulais revenir aux relations entre les deux et la coopération. Nous savons tous que sur le terrain, ça a marché très très bien. En Bosnie, c'est un exemple parfait. Mais nous connaissons le blocage politique à Bruxelles. Et dans son exposé, Monsieur de Scheffer il nous a bien expliqué que les décisions finales doivent se faire dans les pays, mais je voulais revenir que tout le monde connaît le problème, on connaît tous le problème, et j'aimerais bien savoir comment on peut arriver à dépasser ce problème. Malgré le blocage politique sur Chypre, comment peut-on dépasser ce problème et comment peut-on aller plus loin avec des nouveaux responsables à la tête, Madame Mogherini d'un côté et le secrétaire général Stoltenberg. Comment peut-on aller plus loin? Merci.
Merci Marc. Nous passons à la Lituanie, Madame Radza Juknevičienė.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very nice to see you again. I'm here.
Where are you?
In your left. Very nice to see you again, to meet you here. Thank you for your job we did together during your term as NATO Secretary General. And I like very much your point on deterrence of Putin and his weakness. Don't you think that we in NATO have different approach on our strategy, on NATO enlargement, on Russia, because of a false assumption or different perception on current Kremlin regime and future of Russia? I don't think Russia has any long-term strategy at all. And I do think that Putin's aggression in Ukraine is the beginning of his end. Some people think that Russia is determined to live with corrupt tyrannies, but I don't think so. Russia can be different, can be democratic, not tomorrow, of course, but can, because people, they are the same as we are. And don't you think that we have to elaborate, to discuss more on our strategy based on perception? We have to help Russia, and first of all, Russian people, to deal with this tyranny and with the containment and deterrent of Putin, even using a tool of NATO enlargement. If we will have different perception, maybe it will be not so different to take decision on NATO enlargement and other important decisions.
Merci. Comme nous sommes un peu en retard et qu'il nous reste 10 minutes, je propose d'écouter les 3 autres questions et si vous le permettez, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, vous répondrez globalement. Karl Lammers, Allemagne, a la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. It is a great pleasure to see you here again in our NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and I very much like to look back to your great leadership as NATO Secretary General. I have 2 questions, one following that what Radza Juknevičienė just explained. Looking to President Putin, do you think he has a vision, he has a concrete plan, step by step, to increase the sphere of influence of Russia? And the second is, NATO made a clear message, no military reaction, but instead of this, economic sanctions. How would you value the efficiency of economic sanctions regarding to Russia?
Je donne maintenant la parole aux Pays-Bas, Madame Vassila Haci.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for your speech. Mr. de Hoop Scheffer, a speech in which you show the experiences you have in politics, sometimes lessons learned in politics, and also your experience as NATO Secretary General. You mentioned the European Union, and a lot of NATO member states here today are also member of the European Union. So one might say we are NATO and we are the European Union. But we must admit that on peace, security and defense, there's a lot of work to be done regarding the cooperation between EU and the NATO. You said you're not in favor of a European army, and you addressed shortly the sovereignty discussion. But are steps on shared sovereignty not necessary to achieve a better European Union on defense and security, and therefore a better cooperation between the EU and NATO? Thank you very much for your answer already.
And, nous passons à la dernière question, la Turquie, Osman Balk.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am the reporter of the Subcommittee on Energy and Environmental Security. The Science and Technology Committee adopted a report on European energy security, Southern Gas Corridor, this year. I have listened your comments on energy security and dependency on Russia and about President Putin. Former Secretary General Mr. Rasmussen was saying defense matters, and I say energy matters too. My questions: how do you consider shale gas revolution in USA in terms of Europeans' energy security? Second questions: I would like to hear your comments for High North concerning energy security too. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Et Monsieur le Secrétaire Général, vous avez au moins 5 minutes pour répondre.
Au moins 5 minutes. Vous êtes très généreuse, Madame. Let me answer the questions in the order they were put to me. First of all, the distinguished representative of Spain. I said before, and I'll repeat it, at a certain stage when everybody was cutting defense budgets, the mantra was pooling and sharing. If you want pooling and sharing to be successful, there must be something to pool and share. And if you don't have anything to pool and share, well, I mean, what does it mean? Now, suppose, to sound on an optimistic note, suppose that things would become better. It is still necessary, as it is now. Take my own country. The Secretary General was mentioning it this morning with the Belgians, with the Germans, with the British. There is a lot of close defense cooperation. So I'm not ridiculizing pooling and sharing, not at all, unless it becomes a hollow mantra for further cuts in defense. So I think, yes, we need deeper cooperation. We see good examples of deeper cooperation. But we do not take it seriously enough, in my opinion. On NATO-EU cooperation and the stalemate, we all know, let's again be honest, we all know the political hurdle we should cross in bringing NATO and the EU closer together in the political sense. That has to do, the name was mentioned, it has to do with Cyprus, it has to do with the Turkish position, or the non-Turkish position, I should perhaps say, in NATO, and the other way around. And I think there's only one possibility of solving this matter, and that is a solution at the highest political level. That's why I said no NATO Secretary General, no High Representative can solve this, and a lot will depend on a solution, a lasting solution for the Cyprus problem. Cyprus, after all, still a divided island, unfortunately. On Madame Boginovic from Lithuania, nice to meet you again, Madam. I think there are a few reasons, but I'll be brief. First of all, I do think the European Union or Europe does not have a consistent Russia policy. I also think that in the bigger European capitals like London, Berlin and Paris, Russia is looked at mainly through a bilateral prism. bilateral Germany, Russia, France, Russia, United Kingdom, Russia, which makes it difficult for the 28 European Union member states to formulate a consistent Russia policy. Look at the difficulty the European Union had on sanctions. I'm happy with Angela Merkel's leadership in this regard because when she, and quite rightly so, decided that the moment had come, the moment for sanctions came. So yes, madam, there are different perceptions, which is not a strong point of the European Union. We have to live with it, I'm afraid. And I can imagine that it is not so easy when foreign ministers or heads of states and government meet in Brussels to come to any form of consistency. You mentioned Putin's weakness. I agree with you, but I think that's not a plus. That could be a minus. Do not forget that Putin, I think, budgeted on Brent crude around $105 a barrel. It is now well below. So where that's going to lead to, we do not know. Karl Lammers, thank you so much for your kind words, lieber Karl. I think you're right. Putin wants to increase his sphere of influence. Putin wants a Russian empire, quote unquote, in the 21st century meaning of the word, wants to have exclusive influence, wants to create a buffer, which in his view is a sound buffer to prevent, let me say it briefly once again, that Ukrainians become Poles, or Georgians become Poles, or Moldovans become Poles. You see what I mean? I explained it earlier. Sanctions, Karl, I think they should not be an end, but a means to get to an end. And the problem with sanctions is, and I do agree with the package as we have decided upon, but when I say that there's a political, that the only solution at the end of the day is a political and not a military solution vis-à-vis Ukraine and Russia and what have you, you have to be able to play the sanctions instrument over the course of time. Mahachi, I gave, thank you for your question, I gave you my bottom line, not being a federalist and having been a national parliamentarian. Security and defense, I think you and I will very quickly agree that Europe, being the financial economic giant, the political adolescent, is still a military dwarf, and that should change. I do not see in the first place the need for a lot of shared sovereignty, but I do think that foreign ministers and defense ministers, and I mentioned Mali, but there might be other Malis in the future, that they devise much more quickly than they do now a common, not only political but also military strategy. And that indeed means in Brussels that you share decision-making processes. But I'll not go under my bottom line, and that is, I speak to you as a national parliamentarian, that no other one should decide upon young people into harm's way. On energy security, Mr. Osman Balk from Turkey, I hope, I think I said that the United States of America at a certain stage will lift the hurdles they have in law to export shale oil, shale gas. I see a lot of future in LNG. I commended Lithuania. Europe has to build terminals, by the way, and so have the United States of America. So this will take a few years, but I think that shale has a future, provided there's one important proviso, that the price of crude is not further going down and down, because it is already now in the high 70s, low 80s a barrel, which makes, of course, investments in shale or tar sands or what have you, at a certain stage unprofitable. But it's not easy to predict what exactly will happen in this regard. Madame la Présidente, je vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And we can applaud you, not only to have respected the time.